During World War II, Vietnam suffered under brutal Japanese occupation. At that time, American aircraft under President Franklin Roosevelt bombed Japanese military targets on Vietnamese soil. After Roosevelt's death and the end of the war, President Harry Truman, fearing the spread of communism, gave the green light for France to return and reoccupy its former colony. In the north, President Ho Chi Minh temporarily accepted the French presence to avoid premature conflict, while in the south, former Emperor Bao Dai was reinstalled as chief of state under French sponsorship. However, the Vietnamese yearning for independence could not be extinguished, and the Viet Minh forces, led by President Ho Chi Minh, soon launched a determined resistance against the French. By 1954, the battlefield at Dien Bien Phu became a historic turning point. The French built a fortified complex, hoping to lure the Viet Minh into a trap, but under the command of General Vo Nguyen Giap, the Vietnamese surrounded the valley and placed heavy artillery on the surrounding hills. President Dwight Eisenhower rejected France's request for direct U.S. air intervention. After 56 days of fierce fighting, the entire French garrison at Dien Bien Phu was destroyed, forcing France to surrender. The Geneva Accords of July 1954 ended the First Indochina War, recognized the independence of Laos and Cambodia, and temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel in preparation for nationwide elections. For the first time in centuries, North Vietnam achieved true independence. Hanoi was filled with an atmosphere of triumph as victorious troops returned in parades and celebrations, and the nation began building socialism and rebuilding the war-torn land. In contrast, the South fell under the rule of Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist Catholic politician backed by the United States. With Washington's support, Diem eliminated rival groups, suppressed remaining resistance, and established a family dictatorship. The army, secret police, and security forces were used to repress the people, religious sects, and former anti-French militias. Public demonstrations and parades organized by the regime served only to project a false image of support, while in reality, widespread discontent simmered beneath the surface. Diem's regime, therefore, did not represent the will of the Vietnamese nation, but functioned as a tool of the United States to maintain division, opening the way for a period of intense and inevitable confrontation between the two halves of the country. After the Geneva Accords of 1954, Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. In the north, under the leadership of President Ho Chi Minh, the country embarked on rebuilding and laid the foundations for the long-term goal of national reunification. Meanwhile, the South came under the control of Ngo Dinh Diem's government, supported by the United States as part of its global strategy. The nationwide elections for reunification, as stipulated in Geneva, were never carried out. In the South, the aspiration for independence remained strong, and various movements emerged. By the late 1950s, routes through Laos and Cambodia had gradually taken shape, becoming vital supply lines for the revolutionary struggle in the South. The armed forces of the South, known as the Liberation Army, steadily grew and launched operations that put pressure on the Saigon government. To respond, the United States implemented its special war strategy. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy deployed special forces and military advisors to train and support the South Vietnamese Army. On November 16, 1961, the 441st Squadron arrived at Bien Hoa under the code name Farmgate, officially for training but also taking part in combat missions. By mid-1962, enough pilots had been trained to operate full combat squadrons, and U.S. aircraft began conducting strikes to disrupt Liberation Army supply routes. Yet the battlefield quickly proved challenging. The Battle of Ap Bac on January 2, 1963, became a defining moment. South Vietnamese forces, backed by American advisors, launched a large-scale assault expecting only a few hundred guerrillas. In reality, it was a well-prepared Liberation Army battalion. The engagement inflicted heavy losses on Saigon's forces, with numerous helicopters shot down, while the Liberation Army demonstrated its ability to stand against modern weaponry. From that point, the world paid closer attention to the conflict in Vietnam, as a determined nation striving for independence faced increasingly complex challenges. In the early 1960s, UH-1B Huey helicopters were deployed to the battlefields of South Vietnam, but their limited firepower made little impact against the steadily growing liberation forces. In several engagements, coordination between forward air controllers and farm gate pilots, supported by B-26 bombers armed with rockets and napalm, helped preserve elements of South Vietnam's 7th Division from encirclement. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited his predecessor's commitment to supporting South Vietnam, but remained cautious due to lessons from the Korean War. In August 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox reported being attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. At the time, the incident was treated as a turning point, though later evidence revealed it had been exaggerated and largely fabricated by the United States, providing Johnson with a pretext to present before the American public and gain political support for expanding U.S. involvement. Soon after, he ordered the deployment of the carriers Constellation and Ticonderoga. Dozens of aircraft were launched to strike oil depots in Vinh, torpedo boat bases in Quang Tri, and other targets in the north. Additional sorties, flown from Yankee Station in the South China Sea, marked the start of Operation Pierce Arrow, the first U.S. airstrikes against North Vietnam. During the operation, Lieutenant Everett Alvarez, piloting an A-4 Skyhawk along the North Vietnamese coast, came under intense anti-aircraft fire. After expending his ammunition, his plane was hit, forcing him to eject. Alvarez became the first American pilot captured as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. Operation Pierce Arrow not only marked the beginning of direct U.S. air involvement in Vietnam, but also paved the way for the U.S. Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution granted President Johnson broad authority to escalate the war, pushing the conflict in Vietnam into a new phase, where the Vietnamese determination to defend national independence now faced the full force of one of the world's most modern military powers. In early 1964, the United States expanded its air presence in South Vietnam by deploying 2 squadrons of B-57 Canberra bombers to Bien Hoa Air Base. With the capacity to carry up to 6,000 pounds of ordnance and long strike range, these aircraft were considered a serious threat to the North. Yet on November 1st, 1964, the National Liberation Front, NLF, the revolutionary movement in the South that Americans commonly referred to as the Viet Cong, launched a surprise mortar attack on Bien Hoa. Nearly 80 rounds struck the lightly defended base, destroying 5 bombers and damaging 13 others, sending shockwaves through the U.S. command. At Binh Gia village, liberation forces executed a bold strategy. They seized the settlement, then laid an ambush for the inevitable counterattack. South Vietnamese Ranger and Marine units, heavily dependent on helicopter support, advanced into the trap and suffered devastating losses against a meticulously prepared NLF force. US. Farm gate pilots eventually arrived to provide air support, but by then, the battle was already lost. The victory at Binh Gia signaled a turning point, proving that NLF forces could stand toe-to-toe against U.S. trained and equipped units. The scale of these setbacks compelled General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, to urgently request additional jet aircraft for close ground support. But before reinforcements could shift the balance, the Viet Cong struck again. In early 1965, following a series of attacks that inflicted heavy losses on U.S. and South Vietnamese forces, President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered large-scale retaliatory airstrikes. The carriers Hancock and Ranger, stationed in the South China Sea, launched 4 Skyhawk squadrons against the port city of Dong Hoi. Due to low cloud cover, American pilots were forced to descend below 100 feet, dropping 250-pound bombs to destroy anti-aircraft batteries. Amid the fierce fighting, South Vietnamese Air Force Commander Nguyen Cao Ky, though wounded, continued to lead an assault on enemy air defense headquarters. Air operations soon expanded. U.S. aircraft struck strategic targets in the north, while South Vietnamese sky raiders bombed enemy barracks near Cho Long. During these raids, the U.S. Navy lost 3 jet aircraft, 2 pilots went missing, and 1, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Schumacher, was captured. On the ground, the conflict also intensified. Near 1 South Vietnamese Ranger battalion, accompanied by American advisors, NLF units set a carefully prepared ambush. To rescue the survivors, the United States for the first time deployed B-57 bombers and F-100 fighters in direct support, while hundreds of troops were committed to the effort. Continuous bombing runs held the liberation forces at bay, as UH-1 Huey helicopters daringly landed under heavy fire, extracting around 220 survivors from the battlefield. After the major ambush in the South, all restrictions on the use of American air power were lifted. U.S. pilots eagerly awaited orders for a new campaign called Rolling Thunder, designed to gradually escalate continuous airstrikes against military and logistical targets in North Vietnam. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had previously maintained a cautious stance, now shifted to a more aggressive posture, authorizing large-scale U.S. air operations to support the South Vietnamese ally. On March 2, 1965, the first missions of Rolling Thunder were launched from bases in South Vietnam and Thailand, targeting an ammunition depot at Zam Bang. Coordination problems soon emerged. Squadrons stacked up over the target area, exposed to concentrated anti-aircraft fire and surrounded by defensive batteries. In this chaotic situation, Lieutenant Colonel Robinson Reisner, a veteran pilot of the Korean War, took command, restoring radio discipline and directing the less experienced pilots. The attack succeeded in destroying the intended target, but 6 American aircraft were shot down in the opening strikes. Upon returning, Reisner had to report to Lieutenant General Joseph H. Moore, commander of the 2nd Air Division, that North Vietnam's air defenses were far stronger than anticipated and that further aircraft losses were inevitable. On March 8, 1965, 3,500 U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang, marking a major turning point. The United States was no longer only providing support, but had officially committed combat troops to South Vietnam. Their initial mission was to establish a beachhead for unloading supplies and to expand the Da Nang Air Base, upgrading from temporary wooden runways to concrete runways capable of handling modern jet aircraft. Meanwhile, Operation Rolling Thunder continued. Due to poor weather, the second wave of strikes was delayed until March 15th. Over the next 2 weeks, U.S. Air Force and Navy pilots carried out armed reconnaissance missions, attacks on transportation routes, bridges, and radar stations. Although some targets were destroyed, many American commanders grew frustrated at not being permitted to strike larger, more strategic sites farther north. Under pressure, Washington expanded the target list, authorizing strikes up to the 20th parallel, including rail lines, bridges, and supply depots. Missions were organized into target packages to improve coordination. On April 3, 1965, a major assault was launched against the Than Hoa Bridge, known as the Dragon's Jaw, beginning a campaign that lasted several weeks. Although the massive bridge withstood the bombardment, Numerous smaller bridges, ferries, trucks, and locomotives were destroyed. Even as American air power intensified in the north, fierce battles erupted in the south. In June 1965, 3 NLF regiments attacked a U.S. Special Forces camp at Dong Soai. Flares dropped from C-47s could not pierce the low clouds, and South Vietnamese Sky Raiders were forced to turn back without locating the target. Facing the risk of being overrun, 2 American Sky Raiders dove beneath the clouds, releasing bombs at extremely low altitude through heavy anti-aircraft fire, temporarily halting the enemy's advance. By dawn, the camp's defenses were still holding. Continuous air support allowed 4 South Vietnamese companies to break through ambushes and relieve the garrison. One wounded soldier later declared that he owed his life to the Air Force. On June 17, 1965, during another airstrike against the Than Hoa Bridge, known to Americans as the Dragon's Jaw, U.S. F-105 squadrons were flying low when radar aboard the carrier USS Midway detected 4 approaching MiG-17s. In the ensuing dogfight, an F-4 Phantom fired an AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missile, scoring the first confirmed MiG kill over North Vietnam. However, at the same time, North Vietnamese MiGs and dense anti-aircraft fire also shot down several American aircraft, making it clear that the skies over the north could not be easily controlled. The air war had entered a new phase, with U.S. pilots now directly confronting North Vietnam's fighter force and integrated air defenses. At the same moment, the United States deployed a newly created unit, the 1st Air Cavalry Division. This formation was trained for full helicopter mobility, combining aviation, artillery, and armored infantry into a single highly mobile strike force. Soldiers were flown in from bases around the world on C-141 Starlifter transports, often with little rest, before being sent to establish defensive positions and prepare equipment in the field. To provide fire support, old C-47 transports were converted into AC-47 gunships, fitted with side-firing Gatling guns capable of firing up to 18,000 rounds per minute. With streams of tracer fire lighting up the night sky, the aircraft earned the nickname Puff the Magic Dragon and became a constant presence over U.S. bases. At the same time, strategic B-52 bombers were introduced in arc light missions, dropping hundreds of 750-pound bombs. A captured North Vietnamese soldier described the devastation. "One minute I was sitting on a hill eating breakfast, and the next I was on the edge of a crater with my regiment and half the hill gone. There was no sound. Then the thunder came." Beyond bombs and firepower, the U.S. launched Operation Ranch Hand, spraying chemical defoliants such as Agent Orange along highways, base perimeters, and suspected guerrilla areas. By 1965, the program had expanded to cover entire zones thought to shelter liberation forces, leaving long-term consequences for both the environment and civilian health. The U.S. also established the Combat Sky Spot radar system, providing targeting guidance for quick reaction missions. F-102. Delta Daggers stood alert at Da Nang, ready to launch at a moment's notice, while HH-43 rescue helicopters waited nearby to recover downed pilots. From August 18th to 21st, 1965, U.S. Marines carried out their first major combined arms offensive, Operation Starlight, involving naval bombardments, helicopter assaults, and amphibious landings. The objective was to strike concentrations of liberation forces south of the Chu Lai base. In the first major ground battle, U.S. Marines relied on naval gunfire to disrupt frequent ambushes by liberation forces. After capturing large stores of weapons and ammunition and taking prisoners, the Marines claimed 573 enemy killed at the cost of 45 Allied casualties. Soon afterward, at a U.S. Special Forces outpost in Plei Mi, captured documents indicated that North Vietnamese main force units were massing in the Ia Drang Valley. On October 27, 1965, General William Westmoreland ordered the 1st Air Cavalry Division to deploy at Landing Zone X-Ray to seek out and destroy the enemy. There, American infantry encountered a vastly superior force, sparking the fierce Battle of Ia Drang. Despite brutal close-quarters fighting, U.S. troops clung to their positions with continuous support from artillery, fighter bombers, and B-52 strikes. A relief unit was later airlifted into a nearby landing zone and fought its way in to rescue the embattled defenders. The Battle of Ia Drang became the first true test of America's new airmobile tactics and the broader search and destroy strategy. Whenever ground forces advanced or were pinned down, forward air controllers and light O-1E Bird Dog aircraft marked enemy targets with smoke rockets, guiding fighter jets and bombers onto their runs. From late 1965 into early 1966, a brief Christmas and New Year's bombing pause was declared, accompanied by U.S. diplomatic overtures seeking peace talks. These efforts, however, were rejected, as Hanoi reaffirmed its determination to continue the struggle. Meanwhile, U.S. logistics faced persistent difficulties. Unstable supplies of spare parts and components hampered maintenance and assembly of weapons, especially bombs. Ordnance crews often had to reload or alter entire bomb payloads at the last moment before takeoff, adding further strain to the support system as the war expanded. From mid-1966, Rolling Thunder missions became increasingly coordinated. In the skies, F-4 Phantoms, with their agility, provided escort and air defense, while the faster F-105 Thunderchiefs dove through intense fire to strike key targets. On June 29, 1966, the U.S. launched a major air raid against petroleum storage facilities around Hanoi and Haiphong, directly testing North Vietnam's air defense network. After mid-air refueling from dozens of KC-135 tankers, more than 130 aircraft stormed the skies, plunging through heavy fire and dropping their bombs on fuel depots. Within minutes, massive black smoke columns rose hundreds of feet into the air. In response, Hanoi quickly received Soviet-supplied SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missiles. These radar-guided weapons posed a serious threat to U.S. pilots, forcing them to adopt new tactics such as breaking into smaller formations and flying below 2,000 feet to evade radar lock. At the same time, the U.S. Air Force introduced deceptive MiG traps. F-4 Phantoms flew in bomber formations to lure North Vietnamese MiGs into attack, then struck back suddenly. Despite these tactics, many American aircraft were shot down. Pilot recovery became a critical mission. The 3rd Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Group, flying HH-3E Jolly Green Giant helicopters with A-1 Sky Raider escorts, carried out hundreds of daring rescue operations, sometimes venturing deep into Laos or even near Hanoi to bring pilots home. Over the course of the war, U.S. search and rescue teams saved roughly 80% of downed airmen who survived and maintained contact, a total of 3,883 men from 1964 to 1973. Meanwhile, on the ground, American forces intensified their search and destroy campaigns. Infantry scoured jungles, uncovering hidden tunnels and underground complexes used as supply depots and command centers. In War Zone C, the Iron Triangle, 2 massive offensives, Cedar Falls and Junction City, were launched with tens of thousands of troops. Armor and mechanized infantry swept through the forests, driving liberation forces into the path of artillery and airstrikes. At one point, U.S. forces even carried out a full-scale parachute assault to tighten the encirclement. During these operations, numerous tunnel systems and fortified bunkers were discovered. Special teams known as tunnel rats were sent underground to defuse traps and set explosives. Afterward, U.S. commanders declared that enemy units had been driven out, retreating into sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos. In reality, many of these forces withdrew in an orderly fashion, preserving strength for the battles to come. To counter the dense air defense system around Hanoi and Haiphong, the U.S. deployed F-105 Wild Weasel squadrons equipped with radar homing devices, specialized in hunting and destroying surface-to-air missile sites. On March 10, 1967, during one mission, Captain Merlin Duelfson was attacked by MiG-17s. His aircraft was riddled with bullets, yet he managed to regain control, strike the target, and destroy it with bombs and 20mm cannon fire. Operation Rolling Thunder continued to escalate, expanding attacks on key targets such as rail bridges and power plants in Hanoi and Haiphong. On May 19th, power stations were bombed. On October 25th, another air base was struck, and in December, Ham Rong Bridge and additional industrial facilities were hit. Later, a temporary Christmas truce was declared, but as in previous pauses, North Vietnamese forces and the Liberation Front took the opportunity to move supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, preparing for a major offensive, the 1968 Tet Offensive. At the same time, the People's Army of Vietnam concentrated forces along the border. Khe Sanh, a U.S. Marine Corps base in the mountains, often covered by fog, was established by the Americans as a lure to draw in and wear down North Vietnam's main divisions. Instead, it became a siege target. General Vo Nguyen Giap deployed 3 main force divisions, about 20,000 troops, to encircle the base. On January 21, 1968, the opening bombardment rained thousands of mortar and artillery shells onto Khe Sanh. Facing a critical situation, General Westmoreland launched Operation Niagara. Waves of B-52 Stratofortress bombers and tactical aircraft carpet-bombed the surrounding area. Guided by the Skyspot radar system, the strikes achieved remarkable accuracy, sometimes landing within just a few kilometers of American positions. Eventually, the U.S. 1st Air Cavalry Division broke through, relieving pressure on the Marines inside the base. The Vietnamese side also suffered heavy losses, with many soldiers killed and wounded in the fierce clashes. Yet in the larger strategic picture, Khe Sanh had served as a diversionary maneuver. While the U.S. concentrated its strength on the remote border outpost, liberation forces across South Vietnam simultaneously launched widespread attacks, igniting the Tet Offensive. American bombers and fighter jets carried out low-altitude, covert missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in an effort to disrupt the steadily increasing supply lines from the north. F-105. Thunderchiefs simultaneously struck radar stations with missiles, attempting to weaken Vietnam's air defense network. However, U.S. forces also suffered heavy losses under determined counterattacks from the Vietnamese side. As the war escalated, many of Washington's large-scale campaigns failed to achieve their objectives and inflicted severe casualties, while the anti-war movement grew stronger inside the United States, creating direct pressure on the government. In this context, President Lyndon B. Johnson was forced to order a halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and announced he would not seek re-election, presenting it as a final attempt to find an honorable way out. The U.S. had to sit down at the Paris negotiations, where Hanoi sent its delegation, though the early talks quickly reached a deadlock. Meanwhile, in the South, liberation forces continued to expand, launching ambushes and repeated attacks against U.S. bases and the Saigon regime. A year later, the second wave of the Tet Offensive erupted, striking directly at key bases and cities, forcing American troops to withdraw into Cambodia and Laos multiple times to regroup. When Richard Nixon took office, he authorized the expansion of B-52 bombing campaigns, unleashing devastating strikes on Laos and Cambodia. In the skies, U.S. pilots clashed directly with the MiG fighters of the Vietnam People's Air Force. Both sides produced outstanding pilots who earned the title of Ace, highlighting the ferocity and intensity of the air war. At the same time, many U.S. aircraft were shot down by MiGs and surface-to-air missiles, while Vietnam also suffered significant losses. The climax came at the end of 1972, when Nixon launched Operation Linebacker II, known as the 12-day Christmas bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong. Hundreds of B-52s and U.S. fighter aircraft struck in waves, but they encountered Vietnam's dense and well-prepared air defenses. Over 12 days, North Vietnamese forces shot down 81 American aircraft, including 34 B-52 bombers, a figure far beyond what the U.S. Air Force could sustain. The failure of this strategic bombing campaign proved that Washington could not achieve its goals by force, compelling the U.S. to return to the Paris peace talks. Shortly afterward, U.S. Chief Negotiator Henry Kissinger declared that peace is at hand.